Hey, I'm Sean Sposito. I'm an industry analyst from Javelin Strategy and Research. And security, at least in the context of vulnerability rewards, is a question of economics. But the companies that are most equipped to kind of handle those sort of marketplace concepts haven't been very fast to adopt public or even private implementations of vulnerability rewards programs. I mean, of the 7,000 banks, depository institutions that exist in the United States, few even have public vulnerability disclosure programs. So with me to discuss this is Philip Martin. Please clap. Clap, clap. He's the Director of Security at Coinbase. You look good. Sit over there, right at the end. Ty Sbano. He's the Director of Application Security at LendingClub. Please clap again. Thank you. This is great. And Arun Agrahri. Did I say it right? Close enough. And Arun, you're the Vice President of Engineering at Twine, and that's a wealth management wealth management application. So please give everyone one last round of applause. It's the last time you'll be able to do it. You know, I was really hoping to start off with you, Philip. You know, we had this really interesting discussion the other day of the economics of bug bounty programs and how it asymmetrically kind of affects attackers. So I was hoping that we could start there.
It's an economic question, right? So traditionally, pre-bug bounties, the question for a researcher who found a thing was, do I use it, do I sell it, or do I just sort of sit on it or publicly disclose it for the fame? And sort of all three of those outcomes are bad for me, the person who runs the app where the vulnerability was discovered. Running a bug bounty, a public bug bounty in particular, it opens up a sort of a fourth door, right? It gives the user, it gives the researcher, the hacker, a good risk-adjusted return on the investment, right? They're not going to get the same as they would selling it or using it necessarily, but our method is, legal, which helps. And it really lets us dynamically move things around. Like we just. At Coinbase, just bumped up our top-end payout for RCEs to $50K on the platform because we've never had a reported RCE. So clearly, I'm not paying enough.
I mean, I like the idea of vulnerability disclosure programs, but I mean, doesn't that create some perverse incentives, Ty? Right, bumping up your payout to 50 grand?
Well, I think the gamification is always great. I've worked with some amazing people in the past, and thinking about the concept of maybe doing a bug of the month absolutely works in your favor. The challenge that we've kind of discussed in the past and even last night is that when you start thinking about launching, say, an internal bug bounty program, a lot of our context today has been focused on external. I've been against this for a good portion of my career from the standpoint that what if there's a gamification of the process? Now, Philip and I have just met, but if he's doing 50K for RCE, maybe I'll ask him and one of his engineers to introduce me, and maybe some vulnerability will be discovered in a week by me.
Sure.
That's not a terrible thing for us to split 25K each, right? Is that the deal?
But isn't that a valid threat model for an insider threat?
Absolutely,
yeah.
And I think that tests both ways, but there's that gamification aspect that we always have to keep in our mind because as much as we want to trust everyone, there's also that level of distrust, right, within the security community.
Sure, Arun, that does bring up kind of the question of budget, right? Because if you're having these really huge payouts, I mean, you're leaving other things on the table, right? If I'm paying some researcher $50,000, I'm not hiring someone else. I'm not doing another external test.
Yeah, so I think this is too loud.
You can hold it a little bit further away. I just like keeping it on my chin.
Okay. Yeah, so I think when you think about from a budget perspective, the way I think about security is it's a very interdisciplinary field. So there's the infrastructure, database security, application security, and ideally you have to hire like 3 roles because it's very hard to find one security engineer who's expert in all those 3. So I think when it comes to budget, having like a bug bounty program where you are exposing and getting help from a community of talented security researchers instead of you building a team yourself, which is very hard, and you end up paying a lot more than if you just allocate 50K and participate in a bug bounty program.
Yeah, I mean the kind of word of that is right. I'm not going to be paying 50K if I'm just bleeding RCEs all over the place, right? I have clearly a lot of other work to do. But as your program matures, right, you have to keep turning that knob, right? Keep researchers engaged because mature programs are hard, for researchers,
Sure,
right?
sure, but like, how do you define that scope, right? So that you aren't creating those sort of perverse incentives, and you're not just getting everything that's to the left, right? Because I feel like that's what's really turned some more regulated industries off, right? Because I can just run a scanner and I make more than $80,000 a year on these things, right?
And I think,
I mean, that's where I think the maturity of the organization is very important, right? So you don't want to like start a bug bounty program just like from day one. Like you have to make sure, like, especially if you're a company who's dealing with like secure data or like customer sensitive data, you have to have a very like a mature like mindset of like how do you build like the foundational system secure.
Sure.
Otherwise, you know, if you go and launch or participate in a bug bounty program from day one, you're gonna deal with like a lot of noise.
Sure, Ty?
yeah, so I think it's been brought up a couple times today as far as defining scope. Thinking about the conceptual approach of like, hey, let's open this up for every property, every website, doesn't always make sense. Let's crawl first before we start running. Let's think about where we want to start on a key website or an application, and then think about that incentive. So if we think we've done a phenomenal job with crushing remote code execution flaws, well, next month, let's do that bonus bounty. And I think that's a positive incentive. And, you know, Franz and the guys earlier today were talking about, you know, having that intelligence to give them lead-ins. Otherwise, it's kind of this free reign. Maybe they just run a
So taking more of a data-based approach, right? I mean, let's level set for a moment and talk about like kind of that central question, right? Like, so why are so few financial services providers really kind of, you know, engaging with the security community at large? I know, Philip, you had some thoughts.
I mean, I think it's a really complicated issue, right? I think bug bounties are only productive if you already have a really solid vulnerability reporting pipeline to start with, right? If you're having trouble dealing with reports from your internal tools, adding a bug bounty on top of that is not.
So if you can't patch correctly, there's no way this is really going to save you from anything.
Correct. It'll probably make the situation worse because you're going to have a bad triage, bad resolve timelines. You're going to make hackers angry. There's going to be blog posts. It's just going to be a bad scene.
So talk about some of those regulatory hurdles.
Yeah, so as someone that's spent a lot of time on the other side trying to fight these good fights, and this is one of the few companies currently where I'm at that has endorsed a partner in the process as opposed to, well, we'll figure it out on our own and let's just use this handle and we'll just propagate what information goes wherever it goes. But how do you secure that? How do you make sure that that information stays confidential? How do you protect all folks involved? And then at the end of the day, am I going to go back to the finance team and say, hey, yeah, I just gave 10 Bitcoin to some dude on the internet? And no, that's not going to be supported by my finance and my budget sheet. So that's part of the challenge, right?
I think I have like a slightly different opinion on that, like why financial services are not adopting these public programs. So if you think about like most of the big banks are like 100 years old bank, and they didn't start as a technology companies, and oftentimes like in the past they just outsource the technology where someone else built for them, and even to this day today they're still running on like a lot of legacy systems and so forth. So I think it's not an industry problem where like we're not seeing all the financial services not adopting to bug bounty programs. It's more about like, you know, all the modern banks or like fintech startups, like, you know, they are building it using the tools today, and they're actually participating in all of these bug bounty programs. So it's not an industry. I think it's a more of like incumbents or like, you know, companies who are not technology driven versus like still running on legacy systems.
I think the other element that we kind of chatted about earlier and covered really well as far as consent and authorization. So I remember trying to sell aspects to my network security peers and saying, hey, I'd like to launch a bug bounty program. They're like, well, aren't we just inviting more traffic? And well, isn't that already happening? And now we have some semblance of a relationship where we can garner the intelligence. We can start to proactively protect and partner with a community that may add a lot of value. And I think that's the challenge, is that you're opening up the floodgate to something that's already there, but without the comfort or maybe the maturity to handle that relationship. It's challenging in that world that is maybe 100 years old.
Yeah, I mean, I've had questions from regulators on, hey, doesn't your bug bounty just provide cover for CFAA abuses? Or doesn't this make it harder to go after real criminals? If you're running a bounty and your scope isn't tight, then we have to explain a lot about scoping and how that matters and how we scope things appropriately.
Are those state regulators or are they federal regulators?
It's really at every level in my experience. I don't think there's any one like regulator who is doing an amazing job here. It's unfortunately at Coinbase, I'm regulated as the same way that Western Union is, as what's called a money services business. So I'm regulated by every single state independently.
And then overseas regulations.
Well, yeah, don't even get me started. Yeah. So being able to explain that across the board, right, using different frameworks that they're used to, different concepts, is extremely challenging.
I think we've been talking a lot about public rewards programs, right? I just have a final question there for you, Ty. So, it becomes tough for any sort of regulated industry to pay someone perhaps that is unknown. You said something, I want to harken back to something you said earlier. I'm going to pay someone 10 Bitcoin. I'm going to pay someone in a virtual currency.
Some dude on the internet, 10 Bitcoin.
Yeah, so some dude on the internet, 10 Bitcoin. I mean, what about if that person is from an import-export country? And then how do you have that conversation internally to kind of get past that fear with maybe legal?
So in the past, it just didn't happen. So even the concept of trying to send swag or rewards, it was shut down kind of aggressively. It's the aspect of something in my past, in my history, to currently, where I feel bug bounties have matured quite a bit. Having intelligence in the platform, having that reputation score, having some of that relationship actually changes the paradigm to actually have the payout. But then, I think having that partnership to outsource that function as opposed to me sending cash in some strange way, it's just much, much more simpler. And I think the same goes with any sort of threat intelligence, or you're looking for fraud analytics on the darknet, where you need some broker for that partnership.
Yeah, this is absolutely a huge problem, right? Between the OFAC, sanctioned countries, import-export problems, the identity verification problem, even just the tax reporting, right? So Coinbase ran, before HackerOne existed, ran a bounty program directly, and it was just a huge pain in the ass. And very risky for us from a regulatory perspective. I think having a program like HackerOne, or really any bounty program that handles this sort of verification and reporting aspect it's a huge lift for me. My finance team was super happy when we switched away.
Sure. Arun, I mean, do you find that bug bounty companies sort of give you cover in terms of the payment and sort of the verification of individual researchers?
I don't think unless you are like a big giant and have like a big engineering force, I don't think you should even consider running your own internal bug bounty programs, because then you have to deal with all of this payments and triage and how do you communication, all those aspects. So I think it's always better to start with partnering with some bug bounty program versus trying to roll out your own.
And I think this is why if you look across financial companies, the vast majority of them are doing private programs. Right, not public programs, because they can handpick these researchers, they can be selective, they can include people in the process explicitly, as opposed to walking out there and saying, sort of the bounty program equivalent of "come at me, bro." Right.
And there's certainly other risks, Ty, right? Like there's regulation beyond regulatory risks. There's certainly reputational risks to launching a program like this, right?
Yeah, I think
just public vulnerability disclosure program, excluding the rewards.
Yeah, I think we can look at a lot of public examples. The private ones, we kind of fall into that group. We handpick, we look at for targeted skill sets, especially if a new specific feature is coming out. And I think it's important to note that when we're kind of taking this approach, we don't want to just have the floodgates open, because in certain aspects, if they do pop a machine and they continue to go forward and all of a sudden they get really great access to really fantastic data, maybe that payout is worth more on the dark market. But again, their profiles associated with the program, we expect the best, we assume positive intent, but there is that small percentage that Martine was talking about that are out there. And that way they may have a get out of jail free card just to say, hey, I'm on your platform, I was just doing research, right?
So I'm curious, what kind of things we could do to kind of pretend that or prevent that rogue behavior from participants from these publicly facing bug bounty programs?
Yeah, I'd say the big aspect is that community-driven sort of process, like people mentoring each other, helping each other grow as far as having an effective relationship and communication, or even how to write a report. There's a lot of great trainings out there, which I think really help us on this side of the fence when we're trying to fight those good fights with the political battles, with the overhead of, how much velocity does a product team actually have to remediate issues. You need to have that flex. And then when you have that intelligent relationship with verbose information, as opposed to, hey, bro, I found something on your website. I sent it to this handle at your company. Give me, again, 10 Bitcoin, or I'm going to disclose it. And you're like, well, what does that help?
Philip, I mean, did you find that before vulnerability rewards came sort of in vogue, or even public vulnerability disclosure came in vogue, that you were getting extorted a lot? Like, not Coinbase, but at other companies that...
No, I mean, we still get those emails and tweets and the whole 9 yards. I have found big problem on website. Please send 5 Bitcoin to address, and we'll tell you. We treat them like the extortion that they are. We ignore them. They can either disclose via our program where like, or I'm going to give them more than that 5 Bitcoin, right? If it's a real vulnerability, or it's the odds there are so against it being legitimate, and the negative outcome of me acquiescing to the extortion is so high that it's just not worth it. And also, sort of, I think we do a good job at security. So,
it's good to know.
Just to add to that, I don't think that should prevent us to not be public about, or like, not to disclose like the scope, or like, what's the impact of, we want to welcome the security researchers to help us find vulnerability before a rogue, users find them. Ideally, so we are kind of like, setting the program where it's as close to as it would be publicly available to anyone, and then just kind of like, welcoming researchers to help us find and build a more secure systems.
But Ty, I mean, have you noticed? I mean, is there any sort of uptick or downtick in the amount of extortion that programs even say, just anecdotally, right? Like, are you guys seeing less of that over time now that there's a codified process in place?
Yeah, I can't give hard numbers, but I feel just off the top of my head in the past like 60 days, we constantly get emails saying, hey, do you have a bug bounty program? That I feel is pretty benign. That's someone that says, I'm interested. I may have heard through a friend. I've literally had security researchers say, my friend is in your program. How do I get enrolled? And through that type of engagement, I think it's, again, positive, right? It's not something negative where it's like, I'm going to release this information if you don't do X. That's the threat. And that's usually where we have to engage a different team outside of security to have a discussion of how do we respond, or do we respond, or is there legal action? I think in most cases, it's just really helped create a pathway of communication, because I can say, hey, thanks for reaching out. I appreciate that you're interested. Here's kind of the rules of what we do. If you have a handle on this platform, fantastic. If not, I will send it to your email address, create an account, send me the info, and we will reward you if it's a legitimate issue.
Everyone on this panel has a public program, right? You do not. You have a private. You have a private program.
Private.
You have 2 private programs, 1 public program. So go ahead.
We are 2 private.
I love that about you.
Thank you.
One of the reasons is like we haven't launched yet, so it makes sense to start with that.
Good to know. I didn't know. So Philip, I guess this question's solely for you. I mean, how do you deal with all the signal to noise?
It's interesting. So we've done a bunch of different stuff over the years. So right now we're 11.4% valid issues is the stat today over the history of the entire program. We've played the in-house triage, the outsourced triage. We've done hybrid models, and look, I still don't think we have it right. The current way we do it, we're running an experiment right now with the triage service, but ignoring that for a moment, we treat triage as sort of a rotating duty among the AppSec team. They go on triage on call for a week. They handle the triage for a week, and then it sort of rotates throughout the team. This has a lot of benefits, but it's also sort of a little burnout-y for the engineers, right? So we do a lot of automation around, hey, you use this keyword. I'm going to pick on clickjacking because it's my favorite. It's my favorite, not vulnerability. Hey, there's clickjacking in this completely static website with no buttons whatsoever, to which we say, well, you can frame it, yes, but there's no clickjacking. After the 30th time we wrote that reply, we automated that. And we try to sort of target these sort of high false positive types of reports, and to the extent we can, build a canned reply, build automation around it, so that humans don't have to see it or have to see it for 5 seconds.
Ty, how does that signal to noise compare to your private program?
I just did the math in my head. I think we're about double being private, but we had one instance where a researcher reported the same issue 42 times because it was vulnerable multiple times across a page, and we're just like, we'll pay you once. We're not paying you 42 times. Take it easy. But for the most part, I think we're about 24% of like what is legitimate. I think we get double counts quite often. Repeat issues that have already been discovered or disclosed. Maybe there's a slight nuance to it, but if it's not a unique URL or it's not a unique input, we're not going to pay out. And it's important to note that people are repetitively finding those issues, which is good for me to push the agenda to go get it remediated even faster, right?
Yeah. Arun, do you find that a lot of the issues that get reported to you are just from automated scans, like kind of repeat issues?
Yeah, so we are a small team, so we have some triage help from the bug bounty program. So most of the issues that we see is usually things which are low impact, where we will be running one static service on WordPress, for example, and then there's a WordPress vulnerability, and then a lot of people start reporting, and most of those things you can have a better handle on the signal to noise is by just kind of clearly defining what the scope is and what's important for us to get coverage versus what's not.
Sure. Ty, I know I asked this question earlier,
Sure.
but specifically to scope. I mean, we had a large conversation yesterday about how you really want to incentivize business logic bugs, right? Not just pure cross-site scripting or something not low-level bugs, but real. So how do you adjust the scope to kind of incentivize receiving what you really want, right?
I think that's a great question. I've found that being too verbose in your scope actually backfires on you. So if it's 20 pages, and I'm sure everyone will agree no one's going to read 20 pages of exactly what specific static site that you don't want to allow clickjacking on. And I think keeping it relatively simple, focusing and highlighting, but one of the strategies I think we get decent feedback and interaction on is constant reach outs and communication. So while our policy is defined, the top researchers as part of our program, I send emails every other month just to say, hey, we have this new website coming. I want to let you know that it's coming sooner than everyone else, so be aware that it's going to launch, and that way it'll be brought into scope. And I think that opens the dialogue a little bit more, so you kind of flesh that out with your top researchers as opposed to maybe the bottom 60% that find that one issue and never come back.
Don't you feel like being verbose is kind of in the area of being prescriptive versus security is something is better than when you keep it open-ended, where it's more exploratory?
I think I've found if it's too long, no one's reading it, and then you just have to keep pointing back to the scope, and then it's noise.
So it's just like a privacy policy, right? It has to be really simple and easy for folks to follow. Philip, you look like you wanted to say something.
I think this actually points back to sort of the original question. Why aren't more financial organizations doing this? And I think the answer to that is they have incredibly complex scopes, right? Because they have 100, in some cases, a literal 100 years of legacy to deal with. Yep. They're going to be defining these complex scopes about these are in scope and these are out of scope, and these are high reward and those are low reward, because that's just the environment they exist in. That's really hard to pitch to researchers effectively.
And it creates a real need for multi-vendor disclosure, right? I mean, the auto industry. I think there's an auto industry panel right after this, right? That's something that they really suffer. In financial services, yeah, I mean, can you talk about that, Ty?
Just picture your supply chain of any piece of software, especially if you are a large financial and you outsource your rewards platform or you outsource some feature. While you can bring those things into scope, and maybe it's well defined in your policy of what's in scope and out of scope, sometimes it's just by the nature that it's off your top level domain, and it's just trading.coinbase or trading.lendingclub.com. It's just a subdomain there, but it may be a third party. So we have to work with that partner and have that discussion, especially once we find out that necessary information. But beforehand, if we're clueless, if we don't know, then we'll never know. But I think once we get that information, just like any security practitioner, once you know, you have to take some action with that level of risk based on the severity of it.
Sure. So it's almost as if before you even think about having a vulnerability disclosure, a public vulnerability disclosure policy, period, you have to write that into your SLA with all your vendors.
Correct.
Right. I mean, how tricky is that? It seems like if I'm a legacy company, that's a really large ask.
I ask for help from lawyers that know legalese much better than I. I try to read it and act like I can read it, but yeah, I think you need help.
For
Absolutely need help.
Yeah. And this goes back to the original point, right? That unless you have a strong vuln disclosure or vuln handling process independent of a bug bounty, you're going to have a bad time. Right? And that means dealing with SLAs with these vendors. That means having a process. That means doing all these same things you're going to need to do for a bug bounty anyway. That a lot of companies just don't do well.
And also, every vendor that you're partnering with is different. Like, some vendor could be like part of your critical path and critical user experience, and you may want to make sure that a vulnerability in theirs is like, because it can impact your users as well. And there are some vendors which is like, the scope is so minimal where you can just like declare that this is out of scope. Any vulnerability in this vendor is out of scope because we're not trying to make them secure because the integration with them is like very the impact is minimal. So I think it depends vendor to vendor as well.
Sure. So I mean, I think it says something counterintuitive about folks that hold liquid assets, right? Like that some of them just aren't as mature as we'd like to think, right? Like, I mean, talk about the need for a really good maturity assessment.
Well, so first of all, there are varying degrees of liquidity, right? So the liquidity of a loan on LendingClub's platform is different than the liquidity of a Bitcoin is different than the liquidity of a dollar in a bank account, right? And I think there are a number of non-security mitigations, right, that you can put in place in these spaces to say, hey, this attacker just transferred $10 million. Let's call up the other side and say, hey, just kidding, just send that back, please, right?
Yeah, I think Philip hit it earlier. You need to have that vulnerability management program. So if you don't have those clear definitions of what is a critical risk versus that low risk, you're going to get into hot water. And I think that should be built into your risk model. So if we're talking about a specific attack after authentication and they can move liquid assets, well, yeah, let's call in some of the folks in the troops and get this fixed versus.
So it feels like vulnerability disclosure is more of an exercise on your path to becoming mature than like kind of like a milestone goal. Right, rather than
I don't know if it's maturity.
I
I think you can drop it in at any point in time. It's your decision on how you want to handle that, right? Like you could not have a vulnerability management program. You could not have a security team, and you can launch a bug bounty program. Will you be successful? Maybe.
But then what does success look like, right?
Correct.
Because if this doesn't improve my security posture, then why even do it, right? It just seems like a lot of this, like if you're just doing it to be in vogue.
I think we talked about it last night. The ROI on programs within security are more about loss avoidance, right? We're trying to not have a breach. We're not trying to have some sort of legal entity come in and fine us. It's really challenging to give that intelligence on ROI. I know there's been a lot of work done in the space, but for bug bounty specifically, how do you translate that single issue? And I think the thing that's worked best for me with engineering is just translating, hey, we found it earlier in the SDLC as far as we did static analysis or we did a threat model. This is where we discovered it. All of a sudden, it's in production. A researcher found it. We paid them an extra, like $5,000, and the CIO goes, "Oh, we could have not spent $5,000." And I'm like, "Yeah, we could have fixed it here." And to me, that impact, that real-time scenario, is very powerful. But if I could come back at the end of the year, which I plan on doing, and showcasing all of the things we could have fixed earlier on, that'll have that intelligence going into the future.
Sure. I mean, Philip, when you're having these internal discussions, how do you describe the ROI of a program?
I think it's easier for me than a lot of folks. One, because we've been running a program for 5 years, right? So
You have longitudinal data.
yeah, exactly, and also the buy-in is there and it's been there for a long time. But for us, it's about the economic incentive sort of question I mentioned before. It's also just about trust, right? It's about being able to engender trust with our users, with regulators, with people who are looking at the platform and saying, like, hey, is this thing safe to use? Well, one of the factors that you can look at is we've been running a public bounty for 5 years. We've disclosed 30% of the valid reports. Like, you can go get empirical data on how trustworthy we are.
Arun?
Yeah, so it's usually an easier conversation for us as well, because once we kind of put like different level of security vulnerability impact, like this is like impacting one user or could impact one user in a system or could impact like 10 users or hundreds of users. So it's always easier, like once we know that, it's always easier to put a dollar amount, like what's like, what's the right amount, and kind of like build the budget around it. And I think like usually it's always an easier conversation to get that funded.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I was really hoping to solicit some questions from the audience.
Hi. How do you guys decide when to disclose publicly when there's been a vulnerability discovered?
So I'll kick that one off a little bit. I think it depends on the definition of your incident handling process. So if it's a vulnerability, it's remediated within your expected timeline and there's no impact to customers or data, depending on which state you're doing business in, it falls into the natural process flow, which you wouldn't need to fully disclose that. Now, in partnership with your researcher, if they want to disclose it, again, I think that's where, in my experience, legal would have to be part of the conversation. Now, if it were on the other scenario where real data were accessed, that's incident handling and a whole e-discovery aspect.
We disclose on demand. Any researcher that asks for it will disclose it.
Does that have anything to do, are there any regulatory reasons there because you're a money services business?
You mean between that and like proactively disclosing all of them?
Correct.
So we go back and forth about this a lot. I think that we disclose on demand because we respect the effort that the researchers have put into it, and we want to let them get the publicity, if you will, let them get the acknowledgement. We don't proactively disclose across the board because we get a lot of reports in where people are describing like in detail, using their own personal account, how this happened. There are all sorts of things in there. It would be difficult for us to redact that effectively every single time. And the last thing we want to do is, hey, researcher, you reported a bug, congratulations, here's a reward, let's make it public. Oh, crap, there's a session token in there that we probably shouldn't have had, and now all your money's been stolen, right?
Yeah. The gentleman in the hat, Sonic the Hedgehog hat.
Nice, thanks. So let's extend the transparency conversation a bit. Rather than just focusing on like vulnerability disclosures, how do you guys determine the level of transparency surrounding the whole program? Be it disclosing metrics, disclosing just any data around the program as a whole, rather than just the vulnerabilities.
I mean, so I published a blog post, Monday or late last week, on this. Again, a big reason, a big sort of driver for us for a bug bounty is trust, is to give you a view into how we do business, right? So we talk about, in fact, I published the stat that 11.4% valid reports. We've paid out $176,000 to N number of researchers over Y years. And then also talking about sort of how we think about triage, how we do the program. I think it's critical, right? Because especially in the space that we exist in.
But longitudinally, I just want to go with Philip, and then we can get everyone else. But longitudinally, since you have been running a program for 5 years, have you seen any kind of correlation between being more transparent and the quality of reports that you're seeing?
No.
All right, it feels good. Everyone clap for that. That's good. It's just Ty, did you want to say something? Arun, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think from the more the private side, we don't have the data points to actually take it to maybe a public disclosure. It's something that I'd be interested in. I think a lot of the stats are similar, and it just kind of emphasizes the program's signal to noise, things to improve the community, and just feedback out into the world. So.
Arun.
Yeah, I think we're on the same stage as well. We just don't have enough data point. But I think as we spend more time in the programs and the community, we definitely want to be transparent and be helpful from like feedback wise as well.
Great. Sir?
Yeah. We are using one vendor for close to 3 years now. We are thinking of bringing another vendor because sometime one bug bounty vendor may miss a couple of bugs. So we are thinking of bringing another vendor for the bug bounty for the new line of product. Any advice on that one?
So I think the question is like, what usefulness does a vendor really provide, right? I mean, just pragmatically, why would you work with a HackerOne, right? What's really the ROI there?
Yeah, I think it's the platform's features, your automation, how you have it kind of set up. I would not want to include two services for the same output. It sounds like maybe you have a quality issue with your researchers, and maybe not a quality issue with your process. So I would explore more, how do you get the right people in your program versus saying one company is missing issues, because likely, just a wild guess, that's probably a lot of the same security researchers.
I mean, why wouldn't you have like more than one, assuming that both of them or more than one of them have like a uniformly distributed great security hackers, because at the end of the day you're getting more coverage, and then they're not both of them competing for the same budget, right? And then the chances of you getting or finding vulnerabilities sooner is higher once more people are looking at it, versus just only one program is looking at it.
And I think that's also a concern, A, with a public program, right, because anyone can sign up and submit, but B is also the question of technical investment, right? If you're building integrations, if your team is used to using it, if you have an outsourced triage organization that's engaged, it's not a trivial investment to like spin up a new platform.
Yeah, I think then you're going to lose a lot of the intellectual aspect of the double counting of issues. I think then you're going to have to duplicate across. To me, it's overhead of process, and then the people and your team, you're just asking a lot of them to now look at 2 platforms instead of 1.
Yeah, I think the dupe issue would be huge. The historical loss would be huge. I would personally avoid it.
And so circling back, I mean, do you guys feel like there's just like one large pool of researchers and you know it's just a binary? Am I going to report to these guys or those guys? It doesn't necessarily matter what platform I'm on. And then like if it is that kind of a commodity business, right? Like what are the real differentiators?
I think it depends on Gopi if he has better bounties on one program or the other.
Okay.
So if he's paying better on one, I would report there and disclose there if the terms are better. But I mean, for the most part, is there one large pool of researchers? It's kind of an unknown. I think there's a vetting process. Some companies have validations in place as far as tests, intelligence assessments, looking at actual credentials behind it, and some are just public, just sign up and welcome to the program, and others just have this handle, email us, use this PGP key, and then we'll have a discussion there. So I think it depends.
Arun?
I would like to have more than one, just for the sake of like, you know, more programs and more community, you see more innovation versus like, you know, if you just have one giant community, it's like, you know, kind of like antitrust and all that stuff. Sure. So I usually prefer like more than one, so that like, you know, there's a good mix of innovation as well as the different set of hackers and researchers.
Sure. I just want to go down the row. What's one thing that you would say to any company that was thinking about launching a vulnerability disclosure program, right? Not a vulnerability disclosure policy, a public one. What's the one piece of advice that you would kind of include? And I'll just start with you, Philip.
I would say invest in researcher experience, right? Great triage, resolution timelines, communications. Invest in that, and you'll attract better researchers to your program.
I think make it easy for your engineering team. So treat this like any other service as part of your program. Don't make them log into the platform. Just provide it in their backlog, and just that way the product team has this consistent, repeatable way of triaging their own stuff as opposed to 3, 4, 5 platforms for software security.
Arun?
The one thing I would add on top of both of those points is the timing matters. So when to participate in the program is important, especially you want to make sure that you as a company have done the due diligence of like making your system secure before you kind of go out and participate. Otherwise, you'll be dealing with so much noise, and the entire experience for you as well as the security researchers will not be optimal. So when you think the time is ready, I think it's a great program, but timing is important.
Well, listen, please give these guys one last round of applause. Thanks so much, friends. Really appreciate you.